Hello and welcome to Energy Shock. I'm David Lipson. Australia's energy market has entered uncharted territory as the crisis gripping the East Coast rages on. The electricity market operator, AEMO, has taken the drastic step of suspending the spot market for wholesale electricity across Australia's eastern states. It comes after weeks of soaring wholesale electricity costs and amid warnings to residents across 5 states about possible blackouts in the days ahead. And all of this in a country with an abundance of coal, gas and renewable energy.
We'll restart the market once we are confident that the market will operate. What we're doing today is suspending the market because we see that it is impossible to operate the market under current circumstances, and we'll reassess that every day once we're confident that we can operate it and not see generators withdrawing their availability.
The energy regulator is blaming the radical decision on unplanned outages, supply chain challenges for coal and gas, low wind and solar output and price caps. Political reporter Melissa Clark explains.
Australia's energy grid is in crisis. Made up of a patchwork of private and state-owned generators and in transition from coal and gas to renewables. It's facing major problems due to both supply and price problems. The country's complex domestic electricity market is overseen by the Australian Energy Market Operator, or AEMO. The rising price of coal and gas has collided with a spike in demand. Some coal-fired generators are offline, taking out a chunk of electricity normally available. Gas generators are filling the gap, but with most of Australia's gas supply exported, their costs are rising in line with international price spikes. Meanwhile, a cold snap has seen millions of people reach for the heater, and when demand increases, prices usually follow. But AEMO can step in and cap prices when they breach a certain threshold. That threshold was reached in Queensland and New South Wales, prompting the regulator to step in. In response, some generators withdrew from the market, fearing they'd lose money. But with a supply shortage looming, the market operator intervened again, forcing generators to fire up and paying them for it, avoiding load shedding or forced blackouts. But after a few days of fraught manoeuvring by generators, AEMO has now taken the extraordinary step of suspending the electricity spot market across the eastern states, saying it's impossible to ensure there would be no blackouts otherwise. It's not clear how long the suspension will last, but whatever happens next, consumers are about to pay a lot more for their electricity. How much more you'll pay depends on where you live. Residents in parts of New South Wales can expect the biggest price rises, followed by Queenslanders and South Australians. Victorians can expect their bills to go up by as much as 5%, while West Australians will see rises of up to 2.5%. But residents of the ACT will actually see their power prices go down. That means someone living in Queanbeyan, just over the ACT border, might be paying up to $800 a year more than someone next door in Canberra. The suspension of the wholesale spot market by AEMO shows there's been a failure in the electricity market to deal with the difficult circumstances it's facing now. It's also a result of stagnant policy for the energy grid as it's transitioning from being based on coal-fired power to renewables. It will fall to AEMO over the coming days and weeks to find a way through to ensure there is enough supply at a reasonable price. But it will fall to politicians to figure out how to reform the energy grid so that it can provide the services needed over the coming years and decades.
Melissa Clark there. Well, to help us wade through all of this, our business editor Ian Verinder joins me now. Ian, just talk us through this suspension of the spot market, the significance of it and what it means.
Well, it's hugely significant, David, because this is the first time since the market was privatised back in 1998 that this has happened. We've never even come close to anything like this happen. And to put it into perspective, we've now got price caps on gas, one of the key fuels for electricity generation, and price caps on electricity generation itself. So the regulator has essentially seized control of the market in terms of both price and output. You know, as we just heard then, there was no guarantee that we were going to get adequate supply. And, you know, to put it into a little bit of context, at $300 a megawatt, which is what the price cap is, the average price over a course of a year for New South Wales, for instance, would have been about $70, a little bit cheaper in Victoria, a little bit more expensive in Queensland. So, you know, we're talking about a price cap of far in exceeding what we're normally used to, and the generators still haven't been able to make a profit out of that, which is why they've reduced their input into the system.
And as Mel explained there, that's going to mean higher electricity bills for consumers.
Who's going to pay for all of this? So if we're all going to be paying $300 a megawatt hour at the generation side, which is, you know, 4 or 5 times the normal price, that will be passed on to retailers, and they in turn will pass it on to the likes of us.
So how did we end up here? I mean, it's been described as a perfect storm. What are the factors that have put us in this terrible place?
I think the overwhelming factor is probably 20 years of debate over climate change, whether it's real, whether it's not real. Generation companies had not known which way to turn. You know, do they invest in coal-fired generation for another century? Do they pull back and put money into renewables? They put some into renewables. But they've kept these coal-fired generators going far beyond their capacity. There should have been a lot more investment in, just the maintenance of them, keeping them going. And the other problem, of course, that we've got is we've sent so much of our gas offshore that we've created a shortfall in the domestic market for gas, which has then forced the price of gas, a key ingredient into electricity prices, because it cuts in right at the very end. When you don't have enough energy during a spike in demand, you turn on the gas generators, and they add quick supply into the market that keeps the price down. So gas is like the swing price. And if you get a big spike in the price of gas, the price of electricity rises.
I think this is what's so galling to so many Australians, the fact that Australia is such a resource-rich country, that we export so much LNG, coal, that we're so, available for renewables, and yet here we are in this spot.
Oh, it's ridiculous when you think about it in those terms. I mean, we're one of the biggest exporters of LNG in the world. We vie with Qatar for being the dominant force. And in terms of coal, we are, I think, the biggest seaborne exporter of coal. So it is just mind-boggling that this could happen. The gas story in itself is a tragic tale of misstep and miscalculation the entire time. The companies that actually export the coal, the gas, miscalculated how much was in the ground. Forward sold contracts to China and Japan, which they're now exporting to, at the expense of the domestic market.
Yeah, Ian Verinder, it is an astounding situation. Thanks for walking us through it.
Thanks, David.
So how are Australians feeling as power prices surge at the same time as the mercury drops for winter? Well, here's a few people that the ABC spoke to today.
Actually, I'm not happy about it as well, because it actually goes up every year. Every year, nobody can be happy with that.
I'm quite worried about that. It does make me a bit anxious. I've heard a little bit about it on Facebook and stuff like that, but yeah.
I'm not worried. I can't do much about it, so if they affect us, they affect us.
It's inevitable, and fortunately we can cope with that.
I mean, coming into winter, it's the time when you want your heaters on. We've had snap freezers and everything going on, so everything getting a bit more unaffordable.
Yeah, I think it's really bad that it's going up because, I'm not working, my husband's not working, so it's hard to, pay the bills, and it's really going to make it a lot harder. Have to budget a lot harder, unfortunately.
Particularly during winter, it's going to hurt a lot. Very cold weather here, needing the heat with the little fella as well, who's not very well at the moment. But yeah, it'd be a huge pressure on us. Obviously, I'm the only one working at the moment. My wife's still on maternity leave, so yeah, it'd be a real challenge for us.
I chose to come into the office rather than work from home because partly I thought, have to run the heating for the whole house, I'm at home, but if I'm at work, the power would have been on anyway. If I'm at home, I'm using more power than the world needs to. So I actually came in to save a bit of power in the thought that there might be rolling blackouts.
It's certainly going to go up and be a problem for all of us, isn't it? Yes, we'll just have to watch our money, how we spend things.
Yes, we certainly will. To give us a better understanding of this crisis and what we need to do next, we're joined now by Tony Wood, the Energy Program Director at the Grattan Institute, and Lynn Gallagher, the CEO of Energy Consumers Australia. Thanks very much for joining us. Lynn, I might start with you, seeing as we just heard from all those worried consumers. Can you give us any sense of how much more we can expect to pay in the bills to come?
Well, I'd just like to reiterate thanks for, going to consumers and asking them, because that's what we're hearing. Consumers are finding this very worrying times. They're facing both higher prices and the threat of outages, which has been certainly at crisis level. The threat has appeared to be at crisis level since the weekend. We're looking at a couple of $100 extra a year in the average family bill and sort of the equivalent, so double-digit price increases for small business as well. But if that all comes in your winter bill, that's not going to be easy on top of rising housing costs, mortgages, food prices. So it can sound like it's a small amount, but for every family, for every small business, this is a very concerning situation.
Yeah, indeed, on top of everything else. Tony Wood, just explain for us what happened today. That doesn't give any sort of guarantee that the lights will stay on, does it?
Well, nothing's ever guaranteed in this life, David, but I think what happened today was a recognition that we had two external factors, one physical in Australia and one a war in the Ukraine, which had become connected. And in those circumstances, the combination of things that happened was that the electricity market, which normally, like any market, connects demand and supply via prices, wasn't working. The prices were going up, but it wasn't triggering the supply to meet the demand. The market operator tried all the normal rules of the market. That was not working. Therefore, just applying those rules was the crazy thing to keep doing. So they decided to pull the next trigger, which is the more dramatic one we've been talking about. And that is they decided to effectively stop the market and say, look, this market isn't working. We're going to have to stabilise things. AEMO will effectively buy and sell the electricity on that wholesale spot market. That is, buy electricity from generators and put it through to retailers until we can see that the system is stabilised. That will require a few things to happen, but that's where we got to. I think it was the right decision. Anything else was simply going to prolong this for a while yet. And therefore, I think I completely support what AEMO have done today.
So will we still need, Tony Wood, AEMO to, do you think, force some of these generators to actually put their power back in the market? They were threatening to pull it out.
Well, there's a couple of things that have to work there, and there's some very, very tricky rules about the way things can be forced and what the consequences would be. If those gas generators are saying they can't buy gas for that cap price of $40 a gigajoule and make money at the price that AEMO is offering, then they will have to force them to run. And then I think they'll have to be compensated for making a loss. Now, that raises a separate question. In addition to what AEMO did today, should we be doing something, and I think we should, about the fact that gas producers are effectively making windfall profits out of this extra gas they're providing into the gas market in what are certainly very unusual circumstances. But I think someone should be saying to these companies, look, you can't continue to make windfall profits. If you don't change what you're doing, we're going to change it for you.
Indeed, and with those windfall profits taxes that we've seen, for example, the UK introduce, there's been some suggestion, Lynn Gallagher, that some of the proceeds of that should go back to the consumers that are paying these high bills. I assume you'd support that.
Look, I think all options need to be on the table, including that option. I think we've got a while to go, though, to understand exactly what's going on. But what I'd like to do is call out, I think, an issue with the generators' behaviour over the last 3 days or so. most generators have had, available supply. That's both private generators and government generators. And essentially what they were saying is that they didn't have confidence in the rules. So they weren't willing to make that supply available. And frankly, I see that as holding consumers hostage. And that's really unacceptable in winter. Electricity is essential to people's lives and livelihoods. And, if we draw a simple analogy, would we really tolerate that with, water suppliers withdrawing water supply because they didn't have confidence in the rules? So there was a better way of handling this issue rather than over the last 3 days having AEMO struggling to understand exactly what supply was and wasn't available, having to frighten consumers about the potential of power outages, and some of which, there is tight supply in New South Wales tonight. But again, I think what we've got to do is restore confidence in the market. Then we can also get on with thinking about how we're going to help people manage their bills while prices are going to go up, because we're going to see these high prices not just for today, but also for the foreseeable future, possibly into next year. And so there are measures that need to be looked at, which are going to actually take the pressure off household bills and small business.
The energy generators said that it was a simple fact that even at $300 a megawatt hour, they were going to be losing huge amounts of money. Tony Wood, there's also been some suggestions, and as Lynn has just suggested, that there were games being played, there was some brinksmanship, if you like. Did you see any evidence of that, or has the regulator or any of the other the sort of leaders in this space made those allegations directly?
Well, there's at least been some indirect allegations, David, and as a consequence of that, the Australian Energy Regulator, which is the body that's paid to enforce the rules of the market, they wrote to the generators yesterday and said, if you're doing this, you better stop. Now, they didn't make direct threats, if you do this, we're going to intervene, but the sort of behaviour, the sort of concerns that Lynn's raising, they're the things that the regulator needs to jump on. They have the power to do that, and they should, and I'm sure they would, and they will, I hope, enforce those rules and impose the appropriate penalties on generators who've not been following the rules. Now, that is where the regulator has to step in. There's a lot of messy enough going on here, but beyond that, you've got to enforce the rules, and if those rules, again, if the rules of the market are not working, separately, AEMO does what they've done. And then thirdly, I still think we've got to think about this question of why we're paying these very high prices for coal and gas. Remembering that AEMO can't direct a company to bring on a coal-fired power station if they physically can't get coal. So I don't think the concerns about bad behaviour goes across the entire market, if at all. If it all needs to be tested by the regulator, I honestly don't know whether they've been behaving inappropriately, although I've heard the rumours. I also think, however, that one of the priorities is to sort out how the hell are we going to get coal to coal-fired power stations for the reasons that you were discussing earlier with Ian, because that's one of the big issues that caused these power stations to be offline. And once we can get some control over that, we might have that will be the breathing space that may start to give AEMO the confidence that they can look at whether the market can be brought back into service.
We've only got a minute left or so. I just wanted to touch on the issue of privatisation, because there have been allegations today that has played a role in this. Just both of your views. Lynn, would we be better with the government running all of these assets?
Well, I think we've got a live experiment. We've got government generators in the market, or government-owned generators in the market. We've got private-owned generators in the market. I think, though, consumers are right to feel that the controls, I guess, are less when there's investor-owned generators, and they do worry that that's led to the situation today.
Tony Wood?
I think I might disagree with Lynn on this one, David. I think the issue is a well-regulated market. I think a market that works with the right rules produces a better result, regardless of who the investors are, than having the whole thing run by governments. That's why we did it. For most of the last 20 years, that system has worked pretty well, and we've got a very unusual set of circumstances. I don't like the word unprecedented very much, but it may be useful. I think we need to get this market sorted out and bring it back into the market. Because I think a well-regulated market with investors working to deliver what we want from that market is the best way to get the best result for all Australians.
Tony Wood, Lynn Gallagher, great to have your insights. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Well, the global nature of this crisis has brought into focus just how interconnected the supply of different energy sources has become. In addition to Russia's war in Ukraine, there are also other driving forces, including the coronavirus pandemic and extreme weather. This energy crunch has also raised concerns that the transition to green energy will become an afterthought.
A seismic shift in the global energy landscape, triggered by Russia's war in Ukraine.
Until 24th of February, Russia was the #1 oil exporter of the world, #1 natural gas exporter of the world, major player in the global coal markets. And the international community, most of the countries, are pushing back now Russia's aggression, and as a result, we are seeing the global energy crisis here.
Even before the war, energy prices had been rising. The global pandemic forced industries across the world to shut down or reduce their operations, resulting in a decline in demand for energy, and along with it, diminished supply. Now, with China reopening for business, air travel rising to pre-COVID levels, and industry demand for energy worldwide surging, supply is still recalibrating.
And the war has further exacerbated supply chain disruptions, which had previously been brought on by the pandemic, which is pushing up energy and food prices and causing significant price volatility.
The price of crude oil has soared to more than $120 a barrel, and approaching levels not seen since the 2008 financial crisis. And while Russia has been hit by heavy Western sanctions, Moscow has made up for its 800,000 barrel a day export shortfall with the higher prices fetched from the disruption in global supply. Last month, the EU's announcement to phase out 90% of Russian oil imports by the end of the year saw crude jump, pushing up the price at the pump. Economists say that could be felt for some time to come, as gas prices tend to fall slower than they rise in response to fluctuations in the oil market.
The price when you go to a petrol station is shocking.
It made me feel a bit sick just watching it go up and up and up. I couldn't believe that it was that much.
The rise in global energy prices is also hitting developing countries hard, where the reliability of the power grid is already struggling against extreme temperatures and severe drought.
There are several elephants in the room here, and I think one, we need to acknowledge that we need to be able to navigate successfully out of the current crisis without adding more problems in terms of sustainability and going green.
One of the key challenges facing world leaders is how to address the energy crisis while maintaining commitments to long-term clean energy goals.
We are not living in a dream world. I completely agree that the immediate response should include additional oil and gas.
With no quick fix on the horizon, a global integrated approach may be needed to keep the lights on.
OK, let's bring in Damien Glanville, the CEO of Locality Planning Energy, an electricity provider, and Lisa Zembrote from Schneider Electric. Thank you both very much for joining us. Lisa, I might start with you. We're just hearing some of the international factors, and you bring an interesting international perspective to the Australian market. You've worked in the United States and in Australia. Is there anything here that you can see that's glaring right now that we should be doing that we're not doing?
Yeah, so one of the things that comes to mind for me straight away is that we don't have a great deal of transparency into what's happening with our energy system. So whereas in the US, the Energy Information Administration publishes highly frequent data across all parts of the energy system, and that's something that we're lacking here, and it's something that may have played a role in not being able to prepare for what has occurred.
Interesting. Damien, you run a business that has been, brutalised in the last few weeks, to put it frankly. How do you take this news today? Is this going to help smaller retailers like yourself?
No, not really. Transparency is a great term too. I think it doesn't help anyone. Just not knowing what's happening tomorrow or any vision on the future is really difficult. So it's hard enough trying to run a business when you don't know your costs, but now you've got no idea what your costs are. The mechanism that has been put forward, there's no clear transparency to us on how we are going to recover our COGS or our cost of goods to supply energy to our consumers. It's just gone from worse to worse. It's embarrassing.
So you're not excited in any way about this suspension of the spot market? You don't see that as a potential pathway out for you and your business?
Oh, look, it's definitely a dirt road that we've gone down without road signs, but it's a start. Clarity is something that we miss. I think what's happened is the regulator hasn't come out to us and said, hey, this is what we're doing, be aware, this is the mechanism. So that they very much haven't shared their vision there, but maybe we're just a small retailer and don't get a mention on the radar. But this is really, it's for us, it's been coming for 5 to 6 weeks. We've been screaming for a while that there's material issues, and it's only now really coming to light. And
Lisa,
Lisa,
you advise large energy users on how to manage the transition to renewables. What are you telling them at this time, this extraordinary time?
So the cost of fossil fuels at the moment and the fact that the price of fossil fuels out into the future for a couple of years is exorbitant. So moving to renewables is just as good now, if not better, than it was 6 months ago. So our corporate clients whose renewable decisions are being driven by corporate social responsibility or their customer preferences or even the way that their banks are lending to them through sustainability-linked loans and green bonds and these types of things. So there's a movement more towards renewables, and what's happening today just reinforces that we actually need to move away from fossil fuels because that's what's driven up the price in our energy market.
Yes, we are indeed transitioning to renewables. That's absolutely happening now. But Lisa, if you look at what happened in South Australia, for example, in recent days, there were a couple of days there, for example, where renewables were only putting out, I think it was about 1% of all power in South Australia, despite the fact that renewables had the capacity, they could, when everything was going well, provide 100% of the state's electricity. Is that an argument, do you think, for firming power like gas to continue?
Yeah, so there's a lot of work that needs to be done to actually transition. We're just at the very beginning. So an expectation that we'd be able to run the South Australian grid, for the whole year on 24/7 renewables is an unrealistic expectation at this point in the transition of our economy and in our energy system to renewables. But there's actually been testing done that we actually can run on renewables with just a little bit of storage. But until we get there, yes, we'll need firming capacity, and this is why, as Tony was speaking about, we need orderly transition, we need orderly policy to enable that transition to renewables. So what happened in South Australia is just a part of moving towards renewables, and it shows very clearly why we need to have very clear, transparent, known policy that is consistent, because that's something that we have certainly lacked over the last 10 years is consistent policy. Not just volumes of it, we need clear, consistent policy to help us transition our grid.
Damien, what do you make of the timeline that we're sort of moving towards renewables? Are we going at the right pace, too fast, too slow?
I think the transition the consumer needs to be considered first. And I said most consumers want sustainability, they want renewables, but they don't want to pay for it. And I think the key thing here is whatever we do, businesses and small mums and dads and the vulnerable need to be at the front of the queue. So whatever leadership we need in this space, which we've been lacking, needs to consider that first and really map it out pretty quickly.
And what about the role of storage, pumped hydro, batteries? Damien, are we investing enough as a nation in that element? Because you need both.
Well, hydro is an interesting one because I believe Queensland's got its hydro plan off at the moment because it can't get water back up the hill. But, to be honest, and everyone hates the word nuclear, but maybe it's time to consider that too, because everything plays a part in this transition to clean energy, and leaving anything off the table is just, not appropriate.
Yeah, interesting. What do you think about the nuclear question, Lisa? Because that is something that senior members of the opposition have raised in recent weeks.
Well, I think we're starting to lose sight of the other side of the equation here. So we've talked a lot about the supply side of the equation. It would take a massive or a monumental shift in Australians' view before we could do nuclear. But we're forgetting about the demand side. The transition to renewables will require us to rethink the grid. We can't just think of the supply side. We need to think about how can we be more efficient, right? So we've got energy efficiency requirements. 60% of energy is wasted. Let's not waste it anymore, right? We also have the need to do demand response. We need to send price signals. Like, my husband had no idea that we shouldn't be running the dishwasher tonight, right? I had to tell him, how often do households really know that supply is scarce? So providing price signals is a big part of what we need to do to move forward. And education is massively important as well. So, the average household user on the street wouldn't necessarily be thinking about when they should, run their dishwasher, as Daniel Westerman spoke about earlier tonight. And these are the things that we need to do to move forward. Smart grids, as we put EVs into the system, we need to be thinking about software that will control these. So it's rethinking, how can we have a two-way grid rather than this old dinosaur that is, built on this concept of supply that's always there.
And well, Damien, do you agree with that? Because you seem to be saying that we need to be putting consumers first. Lisa's saying, well, more responsibility on the consumers. Is it easier just to have a big sledgehammer solution, like nuclear or more gas?
I think what you've got to consider here is the average punter. Like most consumers and even, at home, I struggle with trying to get my family to understand that basic principle. They're not going to get it. It's not that simple. Price signals aren't going to work. The average punter can't afford those investments in a rental property or one of these a small apartment to actually adopt that. They're not home at the right time. They can't afford the appliances. That's a really big picture. It's a great picture. I'd love to look at it. It's a fantastic fairy story, but it's not real for everyone. No one can actually affect that. So that is a long-term strategy that will take a long time, greater than what we have today, to resolve this issue.
Nuclear, Damien, will also take a long time. It's 10 years minimum, they say. But I guess we've got nuclear submarines coming down the pipeline. Is 10 years, that's a minimum. It could be closer to 20. You need bipartisan support for a start, and we don't have it at the moment.
Yeah, look, and I'm not an expert in that space, but you've just got to consider everything. Batteries and solar have a good play as well. But then we look at the month of May in Queensland, we had some terrible renewable outputs as well, like you mentioned earlier. And you've got to look at the loads in Queensland and New South as well. But everything's at the table. A quick transition isn't really going to happen without affecting the people that don't want to be affected or can't be affected. So we just really got to consider some strong leadership on both sides needs to step up for this, I think.
We've only got 30 seconds or so left. Lisa, I'll give you the last word, a bit to respond to there, I think.
Yeah, I think the most important thing is that this is an economic imperative that we need to decarbonise our energy system. It's really complex. It's our man on the moon moment, as some have termed it. It's going to be really difficult. It's going to require a lot of change, but it's something that we have to do. If we don't, the impact on our economy is incredible. So I think Deloitte Access Economics reckons it's about $73 billion a year by 2060 in impacts. And if we even just think about what we saw here, just a tiny fraction of what's to come with the floods and fires, this is an economic imperative. We must decarbonise our energy system, even though it's hard.
Lisa Zembro, Damien Glanville, thank you very much for that.
Thanks for your time.
Well, as we've been discussing, energy prices are on the way up, but there are a few cost-effective ways to reduce the risk of bill shock. Our top 5 tips for saving money on your power bill are: compare power providers and don't be afraid to switch. It could save you hundreds of dollars a year. All you need is a recent power bill to make sure the comparison is accurate. Our second top tip is, if you're on a flexible pricing plan, use your power-hungry devices during off-peak times. when rates are lower. Think about your dishwasher and your dryer and the like. Next, seal up gaps between the floor and skirting boards, as well as where air is escaping from drafty doors and windows. Adjust your thermostat to between 18 and 20 degrees in winter. You might need a beanie or a jumper indoors, and above 23 degrees in the summer. And finally, switch off your appliances at the power point when they're not in use. Electricity use from devices in standby mode can actually add up to about 10% of your total power bill. Well, here to offer up some solutions and what we can expect in the future is Tristan Edis, an energy analyst, and Professor Renata Egan, chairwoman of Solar Analytics. Thank you both very much for your time. I guess perhaps first to you, Tristan, and perhaps just starting with the problem that we face right now. How did we get here, and what's the solution?
Well, the fundamental problem was the gas price went up because of Putin, and the coal price has also gone up because of Putin. But then on top of that, our coal-fired generators are getting old and they're breaking down, and they're just the fundamental physical problems that we have to deal with. But it really changes the equation, because now, rather than, I think your prior guest said, oh, well, customers aren't prepared to pay for extra renewables. Well, actually, extra renewables is going to reduce their bills, it looks like now, because if gas prices stay where they are right now, I mean, we're talking $400 a megawatt hour. People doing solar and wind farms are prepared to do them for $40 to $60 a megawatt hour. So actually,
but in the shorter term, we've got to invest, don't we? We've got to build those renewables. Someone's got to pay for them too.
Well, the reality is that they cost less than, incredibly, substantially less than on gas-fired generators costing $400 a megawatt hour. That's just the plain reality we can see in the electricity market right now. In fact, we can see it by the fact that they refuse to generate at $300 a megawatt hour.
Renata, what do you think of that? Do you care to comment on any of that, and also what we need to do now? How do we improve our lot?
I can certainly support Tristan in his prediction that we can, if we invest in renewables now, that the price that people will build renewables at is of the order he's talking about, $40 to $60 a megawatt hour. So you lock in a price, future pricing on the renewables for $40 to $60 a megawatt hour, and you can build a solar farm in a year and be connected to the grid, which you can't do with any other form of new energy generation. Nuclear, as he said, is a 10-year commitment if you want to go down that path. So we can move really quickly with wind and solar. Solar in particular moves really fast. And to one of the earlier points too about Australians not wanting to pay for renewables, as it happens, Australian householders and businesses have been investing in solar at a world record rate for the last 10, 20 years. Like, we're well ahead of the rest of the world with individuals wanting to make a commitment to solar for a number of reasons, some of them for environmental, but largely to control their energy costs. And they can see that that's where the lowest price of energy comes from.
Just on solar, and I'll stay with you, Renata, how does Australia's solar market differ from the way it's done around the world?
Yeah, Australia's a really interesting case study. We have more solar per capita than anywhere else in the world. And that's largely been driven by end consumers, by homeowners, by businesses. In most of the rest of the world, solar has gone in the large utility scale farms and the sort of centralised plant, whereas in Australia it's nearly all gone in, over half of it has gone in on rooftops and paid for by homeowners or business owners, where they've actually made the investment themselves. It's something like $6 billion a year for the last 10 years has gone into the solar, into rooftop solar market in Australia. It's absolutely phenomenal, and it's all end consumer investments. It's the biggest investment in energy in the last 10 years has been by the end consumer.
Yeah, it's quite a remarkable story. Tristan, we know that obviously solar, wind as well, it's intermittent power. It's not always there, and it's not as stable as, say, coal or even gas. So how do we, if we're taking coal out of the system, replacing it with renewables, how are we going to ensure the stability of the grid?
Yeah, so one of the key things that has sort of, when all hell broke loose over May, the key factor driving that was an increase in heating load. Now, the key problem is we've actually got plenty of solar's doing a really great job. It's just not doing a really great job for long enough. And in particular, there's this key window of time. It's a short window of time between 4 p.m. and 8 p.m. If we made an effort to actually upgrade our housings to a half-decent standard, I'm not talking a standard consistent with what Europe does or even North America. I'm just thinking just a basic, simple standard. We could dramatically reduce electricity demand and demand for gas between that critical window of 4 p.m. and 8 p.m. And that would make a huge difference in terms of reducing electricity prices and dramatically reducing our need for the most expensive generators, which are gas-fired generators. So we absolutely have to do something about upgrading the energy efficiency of our buildings.
So what sort of things are we talking about
buildings.
here? Insulation, simple things like that?
Absolutely. It's insulation, it's upgrading the heaters. So we actually see a higher rate of death from cold in people's homes in Australia than we do in Sweden. That gives you a feel for how bad our building stock is. It takes more energy to heat homes in Victoria. More energy is consumed by Victorians to heat their homes than in the UK or Holland. And we've got to just get some simple basics right. So replace the inefficient heaters that we have, or even no heater in some homes where they're reliant on these sort of cheap heaters they buy from Bunnings, which are energy guzzlers. Replace them with just a simple, efficient reverse cycle air conditioner and just insulate the ceiling. Just get the basics right. We don't even get those right, particularly in rental properties, because landlords don't care about their tenants' energy bills.
Renata, what do you think of that? I mean, is that a crucial piece of the puzzle, or are you just more focused on solar? We just need more solar on every house.
No, and I do think that the future is a blended mix of different kinds of generation, and we'll need storage to manage to shift the generation to and store it for when it's needed later.
What kind of storage? What do you mean by that?
So, battery storage is where we were world leaders in the battery storage, with the largest big battery going into South Australia some years ago. And we've followed that, but not with a lot of momentum, just a little. If we'd actually really backed ourselves on that, then we wouldn't have the crisis we currently have if we had a little bit more storage to back us up. And you mentioned it a little bit earlier about the lack of reliability in solar and wind compared to coal and gas. And I would say that the problem we have right now is because we have a lack of reliability in coal and gas. We have coal plants which are offline, that because there hasn't been the investment, there isn't the momentum or the need even to keep the maintenance up to them. At the same time, we haven't had enough of an investment in the solar, wind and batteries that we need to replace the coal and gas with. Yeah. So, but sorry, to your other point.
Very briefly, we've just got 20 seconds left.
Okay. So end consumers, looking after the end consumer is really important. Improving insulation is really important. The demand management that Lynn Gallagher spoke about earlier, as in helping people move their loads about and be sensible about when they use their energy, is really important. One more thing, and that is that Australia has doubled the amount of energy it gets from solar in the last 3 years. It's now around 12.5% of our energy demand is met by solar. We need to double that again and again. We're at 50% solar. And we can do that. It's in a 3-year cycle we've been doing that. We can beat the technology is there and the solutions are all there.
Tristan, if you can give us the last word in 15 seconds, I'll give you that opportunity.
We can be optimistic if we really put our minds to it. We're talking a 15-year plan is what we need. We can't get rid of fossil fuels overnight, but in 15 years we can make a massive difference and absolutely smash our energy bills, lower them substantially, and we can do that at an affordable cost.
Tristanitis, Professor Renata Egan, thank you very much for joining us. And that's the program. I'm David Lipson. Thanks for joining us.